Ryan wasn't used to going to nightclubs. That night, everything seemed wrapped in an aura of excitement. After months of struggling to pay bills, she decided she deserved a few hours of escape, away from the suffocating routine and relentless financial pressure. At 25, she felt the weight of a life of sacrifices. She worked as a waitress in a small restaurant in downtown New York, but the money was never enough. That night, her path would cross with Oliver Lacerda, a name she'd only learn later, but one that would change her life forever. Oliver was an arrogant millionaire, known for his fortune generated from investments and family inheritance. He was at the club with his friends, celebrating another business success, and for a moment, he noticed her on the dance floor. Tall, with long brown hair and sad eyes that contrasted with her forced smile, Ryan stood out effortlessly. Without her realizing it, Oliver approached, enchanted by Ryan's subtle beauty. They talked. He seduced her with his words and charm, like so many others before her. Ryan, not knowing who he was, just let herself go. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself not to think about overdue bills, long work hours, or the loneliness she secretly carried. After hours of conversation, laughter, and drinks, Oliver invited her to a luxurious hotel where they ended up spending the night together. The next morning, without many words, he left. For him, it had been just another night of fun. For Ryan, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Weeks later, Ryan began to feel the first signs that something was wrong. Frequent dizziness and morning sickness soon brought the terrible confirmation she was pregnant. Her world collapsed at that moment. She could barely support herself. How could she raise a child? Desperate, she tried to contact Oliver, with the vague hope that he might care. He was the father, after all. With the little money she had, Ryan managed to locate Oliver through social media and decided to go to the building where he worked. Her heart was racing uncontrollably when she entered the elegant lobby of his company. Dressed simply, she felt out of place among the men in suits and well-dressed women. Finally, she was called to go up to the floor where Oliver had his office. When he saw her, sitting behind a glass desk with an expression of boredom and disinterest, something inside Ryan broke. She could barely explain the situation before he interrupted her. "I have nothing to do with this," he said coldly. "I won't be responsible for your mistake. I told you not to take this seriously, didn't I?" Ryan, with tears in her eyes, tried to argue, but it was in vain. He stood up, opening the door for her to leave, making it clear that he didn't want to hear anything more. The humiliation burned inside her. Ryan stumbled out, her eyes blurred with tears, and her heart in pieces. Alone, without support, with no one to turn to, she walked out of that luxurious office and back to the real world, a world of poverty, pain, and now, a child on the way. From that moment on, she knew she was on her own. Part 2/9, alone with the weight of pregnancy. The following months were hell for Ryan. The pregnancy progressed, and with it came difficulties that seemed to multiply each day. The rent for the small apartment where she lived in a poor neighborhood of New York was overdue. Her waitress salary didn't cover even the basic necessities, and hunger began to be part of her routine. Each time she looked at her body, now transformed by pregnancy, a mixture of fear and despair consumed her. Her bosses at the restaurant where she worked noticed that Ryan's belly was growing, and soon the insinuations began. "You won't be able to work like this for much longer," one of them said dismissively, caring little about her situation. Even exhausted, Ryan couldn't afford to stop. She needed the job. Without it, there would be no money for absolutely anything, not even for the medical appointments she was already skipping due to lack of resources. Her health began to deteriorate. One day, during a particularly long shift, Ryan felt a strong dizziness. She held onto the counter, trying to appear fine, but her knees gave way, and she collapsed on the floor. The sound of dishes breaking was muffled by the silence of the customers and judgmental looks. The manager, impatient, came to her without offering help. "I think it's time for you to step away, Ryan," he said, not disguising the tone of contempt. "We can't continue like this anymore. We'll need to find someone else for your position." Those words were like a knife blow. Being dismissed like that, without any support, only increased her despair. She was sent home that same day, not knowing if she would ever work again. Fear gnawed at her. How would she support her child alone? Without friends or family nearby, Ryan spent most of her time cloistered in her tiny apartment. The pains in her back and legs prevented her from moving easily, and the morning sickness, which now lasted all day, made the simple task of eating a torment. The savings she had, already small, began to run out quickly. Without work, without help, and with her belly growing ever larger, she felt as if she were sinking into a bottomless pit. Ryan tried to contact Oliver again. She didn't know what she expected, perhaps a remnant of humanity, some sign that he might take responsibility, even if minimally. However, all attempts were ignored. He had blocked her number and disappeared from social media as if she had never existed. The humiliation hit her like a punch to the stomach. How did she allow her life to reach that point? All the dreams she once had of improving her life, of finding financial stability, now seemed like nothing more than cruel jokes that reality liked to repeat in her mind. The months slowly advanced. Each night was filled with silent tears and pains that came not only from pregnancy, but also from emotional anguish. She dreamed of the baby she was carrying, while wondering how she could offer anything to him. Ryan knew the future was uncertain and gloomy, but one thing kept her standing, the promise that, somehow, she would find a way to survive for that little being growing inside her. The night seemed eternal. The neighbors, always wrapped up in their own struggles, hardly knew of the internal storm Ryan was facing. She woke up in the middle of the night, startled by nightmares, her body sweaty and her chest tight with anxiety. The loneliness seemed greater each day, and, despite all the difficulties, the life inside her was the only thing that kept her from giving up on everything. The day of delivery was approaching. In one of the rare medical consultations she managed to have, the doctor told her something that made her freeze inside. "Your baby has a serious heart complication," he began, with a grave expression. "As soon as he's born, he'll need emergency surgery to survive." Those words echoed in Ryan's mind like a death sentence. A surgery? How would she pay for such an expensive operation? Oliver's shadow came back to haunt her. She had tried, for weeks, to push away the idea of asking for help again, but now, she had no choice. The baby she carried in her womb, the same one that kicked and moved inside her, needed something she could never give alone. She knew she would have to go after Oliver again, not for herself, but for the child. Even if it meant being humiliated once more, this time, she would face everything for the sake of the child. Ryan was at the limit of despair. The days before the delivery passed like a fog of uncertainties and fear. Each movement of the baby inside her reminded her of the fragility of the life she carried and the overwhelming responsibility she would soon face. She knew she needed money for her child's surgery, but options were running out. The overcrowded and under-resourced public hospital had made it clear that they couldn't perform the necessary operation. The only solution was to go back to Oliver, the same man who had despised and humiliated her, who had left her alone from the moment he knew about the pregnancy. Deep down, she feared another rejection, but now she had no choice. The baby's future depended on it. It was as if life was taking everything from her, except the survival instinct that forced her to fight for her child. With effort, Ryan managed to get out of bed that morning. The pregnancy was already advanced, and every movement was painful. She took the crowded bus, each jolt aggravating the pains in her back and legs. Upon arriving in front of the imposing building where Oliver worked, she hesitated for a moment. The reflection in the huge glass doors revealed an image of herself she barely recognized. Thin, haggard, eyes sunken from so many sleepless nights, and a face tired from the incessant struggle. For my son," she whispered to herself before crossing the door. In the lobby, she was stopped by the receptionist. "I have a meeting with Oliver Lacerda," Ryan said, her voice faltering with nervousness. The receptionist, an impeccably dressed woman with a disdainful look, looked her up and down, clearly suspicious. "And, do you have an appointment?" she asked coldly. "No, but it's urgent. I need to talk to him. He's the father of my child, The words came out faster than Ryan could control. The receptionist's eyes widened for a moment, but soon the contemptuous expression returned. She picked up the phone with disgust, calling directly to Oliver's office. When she finished the call, she gave a brief nod for Ryan to follow to the elevator. Without another word, Ryan went up. Her heart was racing in her chest. Her hands were shaking, and she knew she was on the verge of something decisive. As she entered the office, there he was, Oliver, sitting behind his imposing desk, wearing an expensive suit, his expression as indifferent as ever. To him, Ryan was just a vague memory of a night he had already forgotten. "What do you want?" he said, without beating around the bush, barely raising his eyes from the papers in front of him. Ryan hesitated for a moment, feeling her legs weaken. "Our son," she began, her voice choked. "He hasn't even been born yet, and he'll already need heart surgery. I can't pay Oliver. I need your help. You're his father. You have the resources. Please." The words came out as a desperate plea. She hated being there, humiliated once again, but now her dignity didn't matter. It was for her child's life that she was willing to do anything. Oliver, however, seemed unmoved. He let out a long sigh and finally raised his gaze to her, his eyes cold and calculating. "And what do you expect from me, Ryan? That I simply open my bank account because you had a child I didn't want? I'm not obligated to do anything. You decided to keep this child, and now the problems are yours, not mine." Each of Oliver's words was like a dagger, cutting deeper than Ryan could bear. She tried to stay strong, but the pain of being treated that way made her body tremble. "He'll die, Oliver. Are you listening? He'll die if he doesn't have this surgery. I have no one." Tears began to fall uncontrollably down Ryan's face. Oliver observed her for a few seconds, as if analyzing the situation from a purely practical point of view. Finally, he stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the city. "Look, I'll be honest with you." He turned back to Ryan, his eyes full of coldness. "I won't help. I'm not obligated to support a child you decided to have on your own. By the way, have you thought about another alternative? Maybe giving up this child is the best solution for you." Ryan, shocked, took a step back. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. That suggestion to abandon the baby, to give up the only thing that still gave any meaning to her life, left her in pieces. There were no more pleas, no more chances. Oliver was determined not to get involved. She began, her voice now weak and destroyed. "You are a monster." Oliver just smiled slightly, as if he were immune to her pain. "I have my own problems, Ryan. If you're looking for someone to solve yours, it's not me." She didn't wait any longer. With what little strength remained in her body and soul, Ryan left the office. The tears were no longer discreet. She cried openly as she walked through the busy streets, feeling small, crushed by reality. People passed her without noticing her suffering. It was as if the world kept turning, oblivious to the nightmare she was living. She knew she was alone, more than ever. Now, the question wasn't just survival, but how she would find a solution to save her baby. The only certainty was that Oliver would not be part of that solution. Upon returning home, she felt a sharp pain in her belly. The pains that had accompanied her in recent days were more intense. Ryan felt her body give way, and before she could reach the bed, she collapsed on the floor of the small apartment, holding her womb in desperation. Labor was beginning, and she wasn't ready for what would come next. Part April 9th, the miracle that becomes despair. Ryan felt a deep pain, unlike any she had ever experienced. The cold room of the public hospital where she was treated was full, doctors and nurses running from side to side, and the agony that filled the air seemed to suffocate her even more. When she arrived, alone and without strength, she could barely explain that the baby was being born. The nurses quickly took her to the delivery room, and everything turned into a blur. Labor was exhausting, longer than she could bear. Each contraction seemed to tear her body from the inside out, and Ryan could only think about survival, not hers, but that of the baby she hadn't yet seen. The doctor's words about the necessary surgery hammered in her mind. The child she was about to bring into the world would have no chance without the operation, and she knew that, Even before holding him, she was already losing the battle. After endless hours of pain, one last push. The baby's cry filled the room for a brief moment, but soon the initial euphoria gave way to panic. The nurses exchanged quick and urgent glances among themselves. The doctor who helped with the delivery quickly took the newborn and took him to another room, while Ryan, exhausted and still full of pain, tried to understand what was happening. What's wrong?" she asked, her voice weak, almost inaudible. "Your son needs immediate care, ma'am." "We'll do our best," said one of the nurses, without giving many details, as she followed the doctor out of the room. Ryan tried to lift her head, but fatigue and weakness were overwhelming. All she wanted was to see her son's face. It was her right, after everything she'd been through. But instead, she lay there alone, surrounded by the sound of machines and the emptiness growing inside her. Hours passed until finally a doctor entered the room. The expression on his face was serious, and it made Ryan's heart stop for a moment. "The baby is in a delicate condition. The heart problem we mentioned before is serious, and we need to operate on him immediately." The doctor paused, as if trying to find a way to soften what he would say next. "This surgery is complex and expensive. The public hospital doesn't have the necessary resources to perform this type of procedure. You need to take him to a specialized private clinic." The words were like a final blow to her already tired soul. "But I can't pay for that," Ryan replied, her voice barely coming out. I don't have the means. I don't have anyone else." The doctor sighed, visibly uncomfortable. He had seen that scene before, desperate families unable to save their loved ones. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the baby needs to be transferred as soon as possible. Any delay could be fatal." As soon as the doctor left, leaving her alone once again, Ryan broke down in tears. The world seemed to be crumbling around her, without mercy. How could she lose her son like this? She had spent months alone, carrying the weight of this pregnancy, facing physical and emotional pains without help. And now, when everything should have had a small chance of working out, life was taking away the only thing that still kept her standing. She didn't have time. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, she would lose the baby forever. Her thoughts turned to Oliver, the man who could, with a single gesture, save their son's life. But she knew he would reject her again, that he would mock her pain as he had done before. He had already made it clear that he would not take responsibility. Still, 3 days after giving birth, Ryan had no other option. Even knowing he was the last man she would want to ask for help, she decided to make one more attempt. She stood up with difficulty, still feeling the pains of childbirth, put on the wrinkled clothes that had been thrown on a nearby chair, and left the hospital, leaving her son under the care of the nurses, praying that he would hold on until she could get the money. Every step through the streets of New York was torture. Her body was fragile, and the pain from the recent C-section made every movement a torment. The distance to Oliver's office seemed unbearable, but Ryan couldn't stop. Her mind could only think of the baby, the machines connected to his small, defenseless body, and the sound of nurses talking about time running out. When she arrived at the imposing building, the same receptionist greeted her with the same look of contempt. But this time, Ryan didn't beg, didn't plead. The emotional exhaustion was so great that she simply demanded to see Oliver, her voice firm, though trembling. When she was finally taken to the office, Oliver looked at her impatiently. "What do you want now?" he asked, irritated. "I already told you, I won't get involved in this." "Our son." Ryan's voice came out weak, but desperation was in every word. "He was born, Oliver, and he'll die if he doesn't have the surgery. I beg you. I don't know what else to do. He's your son too. I won't ask for anything else after this. Just save his life." Oliver crossed his arms, observing her in silence for a few seconds. Then he shrugged. "That's not my problem, Ryan. I warned you from the beginning. I'm not going to spend money on something I didn't choose. I never wanted this child, especially with you, a woman who will never be at my level, and I won't take responsibility now." Those words were confirmation that Oliver had no humanity. He didn't care, felt nothing for Ryan or the baby. For him, they were just an unwanted distraction. With a crushed heart, Tears ran silently down Ryan's face. She couldn't speak anymore. There was nothing left to say. He wouldn't help her. The baby would die. And she was nothing to him. With no other way out, Ryan left the office, without even the strength to lift her head. She didn't know what she would do now. When she reached the street, she felt empty, broken. There was nothing more she could do. The baby, whom she hadn't even had the chance to hold in her arms, was condemned. In the midst of the big city crowd, Ryan cried like she had never cried before, feeling completely powerless, while the world around her continued to spin, indifferent to her pain. May 9th. The Last Hope. Ryan was destroyed. Sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by the dust and chaos of the city, she could barely breathe. Her mind wandered, trapped in a cycle of dark thoughts about the baby's future and the brutal reality that time was running out. That little being, her son, was in a hospital bed, fighting to survive. And she could do nothing. Her arms and legs trembled with exhaustion and pain. The recent birth had left her body debilitated, but the physical pain was just a shadow compared to the mental torment consuming her. Oliver's rejection, raw and definitive, had been the final blow. He never wanted to know about her, and now he left her to carry the guilt, the weight, the responsibility. But she couldn't give up.
Not now.
Not while her son was still breathing. Suddenly, an idea began to form in her mind. A vague memory, something she had heard casually while waiting for Oliver at the hospital days before. There was a private clinic, one of the best in the city, where they performed complicated surgeries on newborns. But it wasn't just any clinic. It was a place where the costs were exorbitant, beyond anything Ryan could even imagine paying. She knew it was impossible to cover the expenses, but something inside her refused to accept the inevitable. Maybe, just maybe, there was some way to convince them to do the surgery. She didn't know how or where to start, but this was her last hope. With difficulty, Ryan got up and walked through the streets, her vision blurred by tears and her body trembling. Each step was painful, but she forced herself to continue. The clinic wasn't far, but it seemed the distance grew with every meter she advanced. Finally, after some time, she saw the imposing facade of Santa Helena Clinic. The building seemed to shine in the late afternoon light, a modern, clean construction, unattainable for someone like her. Upon entering the lobby, she was immediately surrounded by judgmental looks. The people there were dressed in elegant clothes, matching the sterile and luxurious environment. Ryan, with her disheveled appearance, wearing wrinkled clothes still stained with dried blood from childbirth, knew she didn't belong there. But she had no time to worry about that. She approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with thin glasses and a rigid posture looked at her with suspicion. "I need to talk to a doctor about my son. He was born with a heart problem." Ryan's voice faltered. "I need urgent surgery, please. I know this is a private clinic, but he'll die if you don't do something." The receptionist observed her with cold, calculating eyes. She seemed to be used to this type of situation, where desperate people begged for help in a place that served only the elite. "Do you have insurance?" the woman asked dryly. Ryan shook her head, almost without the strength to answer. "I don't have insurance or money, but I can pay later." The words came out as a whisper. "I can work, pay in installments. Please, just save my son." The receptionist didn't seem impressed by Ryan's appeal. She sighed, adjusting her glasses, and said, "Without insurance or advance payment, we can't schedule any procedures. Heart surgeries are expensive, ma'am, and this clinic doesn't offer charity treatments." "But he's just a baby," Ryan whispered, her voice already fading. "He hasn't even started to live." The woman stared at her for a moment, perhaps noticing the desperation in Ryan's eyes, but maintained her firm posture.
"I'm sorry."
"There's nothing we can do." Ryan's world was falling apart around her. Once again, she was being rejected. Once again, her son was being condemned. But before she could leave the room, defeated, a figure approached. A tall man in a white coat, with a serious expression, stopped beside the counter. He seemed to have overheard the conversation. "What's going on here?" he asked, casting a disapproving look at the receptionist. Ryan looked at him, her eyes swollen with tears, and tried to explain. My son, he needs heart surgery. I can't pay, but he'll die if you don't do the operation. Please. The doctor, identified by a badge as Dr. Joseph, looked at her with more empathy than anyone else up to that moment. He took a deep breath and motioned for Ryan to follow him. The receptionist cast a disapproving look but said nothing. Come with me, said the doctor, leading her to an office at the end of the hallway. Let's talk. When they entered, Dr. Joseph sat across from Ryan, who could barely keep herself upright in the chair. Your baby is in the public hospital now? He asked in a softer tone. Ryan nodded. They said he won't survive without the surgery. I tried everything. I went after his father, but Ryan's voice broke, and the tears returned forcefully. The doctor was silent for a moment, pondering. He seemed to be weighing the options, observing Ryan's devastated state. The situation is critical, then, he said, finally. And the public hospital doesn't have the resources your son needs.
No.
Ryan murmured, ashamed. And you have no way to pay for the surgery here, he concluded, shaking his head slightly. Ryan remained silent, her eyes full of fear and anguish. I'll talk to the administration, he said suddenly. I'll see what we can do. I can't promise anything, but sometimes we make exceptions in urgent cases. Don't lose hope yet. That was the first spark of hope Ryan had felt in weeks. Although fragile and uncertain, she clung to these words as if they were her last chance to save her son. Dr. Joseph stood up and left the room, leaving her alone for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Minutes later, he returned, his expression more severe. I managed to convince the board to take your son's case. He will be transferred today to our neonatal unit. The surgery will be done as soon as possible. Ryan could hardly believe what she was hearing. She tried to thank him, but the emotion was so great that the words wouldn't come out. Her heart tightened in a mixture of relief and fear. Thank you, was all she could whisper, as tears started to run down her face again. But know one thing, said the doctor in a more serious tone. This won't be easy. We'll need all the medical documents, and afterward, there will be a long recovery process. And as for payment, well, we'll talk about that later. The important thing now is to save your son's life. So, you're saying that the father of your child, a millionaire businessman, refuses to help pay for the surgery that would save the baby's life? The man asked, while taking notes. Ryan nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. I know he's not directly breaking any laws, but is there anything I can do? He has the resources to save the baby, but he's leaving me alone in this. I just want a chance to fight. The investigator remained silent for a few moments, pondering. Then, he took a deep breath and said, Look, this situation is complicated. He might be morally responsible, but legally, you can't force him to do anything, especially if he hasn't acknowledged paternity. The only thing that could make an impact is if this case gains public attention. He might not care about you or the baby, but public exposure could damage his image, and that might force him to act. Ryan listened to the words carefully. The investigator was right. Oliver didn't care about her or the child, but if his reputation was threatened, he might finally give in. She didn't want things to come to that, but she had no other options. And so, a plan began to form in her mind. She thanked the officer and left the police station with a new idea. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but this was her last chance. And this time, she wasn't alone. Upon returning home, Ryan contacted some local blogs and journalists. She knew she wasn't big enough to reach traditional media, but with social media, stories like hers could spread quickly. With the help of an acquaintance who had worked as a freelancer, she wrote a detailed account of her story, from her encounter with Oliver to the desperate situation of the baby. The title of the article said it all: Millionaire's Son on the Brink of Death, the cruelty of a father who refuses to help. The first few hours after publication were slow. Few views, some likes, but nothing more. Ryan was starting to lose hope when, suddenly, her phone began to vibrate nonstop. Message after message arrived, shares, comments from people outraged by the story. In no time, the article gained traction. The hashtag Oliver Help Your Son started appearing on social media, with dozens, then hundreds of people tagging Oliver's name and his company, demanding answers. Within 24 hours, the case became news on larger websites. People wanted to know more. They wanted answers. They wanted to see justice. Oliver Lacerda's name was in all the headlines, and the scandal began to spread. It was the kind of attention he couldn't ignore. The scandal involving Oliver Lacerda took on proportions that no one, not even Ryan, could have predicted. The news spread like wildfire on social media, with thousands of people outraged by the story of the millionaire who refused to help his own dying son. The hashtag Oliver Help Your Son gained traction, and soon major media outlets were covering the case. Ryan, exhausted and still incredulous at the speed of it all, spent her days at the clinic, by her son's side. The pressure on Oliver grew with each passing minute, and Ryan knew he couldn't ignore it for much longer. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, she had no time to think about anything other than the baby, who continued to fight for survival. Each day, the child's condition fluctuated between danger and recovery. Dr. Joseph, always patient and calm, did his best to keep her informed and optimistic, but the financial debt continued to grow. Ryan knew the clinic was holding out as long as it could without demanding immediate payments, but soon the grace period would end. And if Oliver didn't give in, she didn't know what she would do. The following afternoon, at the peak of the news, Ryan received an unexpected call. The number on her cell phone screen was unknown, but she answered, her heart tight. On the other end of the line was the voice she would recognize anywhere, Oliver. "We need to talk," he said, without preamble, and quickly added, "I'm coming to the clinic now." The call was short and to the point. Ryan knew the scandal had finally forced him to act, but what was he planning? Even though she had managed to expose his cruelty to the world, she wasn't sure how he would react personally. 40 minutes later, Oliver appeared at the clinic. He was no longer dressed like the carefree businessman who had humiliated her so many times. There was a tense, almost somber expression on his face. When she saw him, Ryan felt a mix of anger and hope. It was strange to face him after everything that had happened, but now, she was stronger. "Let's get straight to the point," Ryan said Oliver, sitting down in a chair in the small waiting room of the clinic. "You've put me in a difficult situation. The media is destroying me because of this story. It's affecting my business, and I need to end this immediately." Ryan remained silent for a few seconds, letting him finish. Then, she spoke with a firm voice, full of conviction. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Oliver. I did this because you made it clear that you wouldn't help me. You rejected me, rejected us. And I had no choice. All I want is to save my son. Nothing more. I warned you from the beginning that I didn't want to be part of this." But Oliver paused for a moment, sighing. "I can't let this story continue. Let's resolve this now." "What do you mean?" Ryan asked, suspicious. "I'll pay for the surgery and any treatments he needs," he said, without hesitation. "I'll cover all the medical expenses, and I'll give you $2 million after 1 year if you take back everything you said to the media, and after that, I expect you to forget my name. No more media, no more emotional blackmail. I want you out of my life and take this story with you." Ryan listened to every word carefully. This was the Oliver she knew, cold, pragmatic, concerned only with his own image. But now he was offering exactly what she needed. It didn't matter how he justified the help. What mattered was that the baby would have a chance to live. "You really think you can buy everything?" Ryan asked, feeling the anger burn inside her. Oliver looked at her, impassive. "You said you wanted to save your son. That's what I'm offering. I'm not asking for anything more. Accept the help and move on with your life." Ryan looked at the floor for a moment, her mind spinning with conflicting emotions. She wanted so badly to confront him, to tell him everything she had been through, all the pain and suffering he had caused. But it wasn't about her.
It was about the baby.
And now, the only thing that mattered was ensuring he got the treatment he needed to survive. "All right," Ryan said, finally looking up. "I accept. Not for you, but for him."
For my son.
Oliver nodded, as if he already knew she wouldn't have any other choice.
Good.
"I'll arrange the payment with the clinic administration." And as promised, I'll be out of your life forever. Ryan felt her heart tighten at those words, but she already knew that was what would happen. Oliver would never be part of the baby's life. Even if he helped save the child now, he didn't want any involvement. And as much as it hurt, maybe it was better that way. Oliver stood up and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time.
This ends here, Ryan. Don't try to contact me again.
And don't you contact us either. My son will never know he has the blood of a heartless person like you. Goodbye, Oliver. May you burn in hell with your selfishness. And with that, he was gone. The weeks that followed were long and filled with ups and downs. The surgery was paid for, and the clinic gave the baby the necessary care. Ryan spent every moment by her son's side, watching him improve little by little. Dr. Joseph remained optimistic but always cautious in his expectations. The baby still had a long road ahead, but now he had a chance. The days passed, and finally, the moment Ryan had been waiting for arrived. The baby, after weeks in the incubator, was strong enough for her to hold him for the first time. When the nurse placed the small body in her arms, Ryan cried with joy and relief. She felt his weight, his calm breathing, and for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace washed over her. "You are so strong," she whispered, caressing the baby's small face. "We did it. I promise I will always be here for you." She looked at her son and, in that moment, realized that everything she had been through, all the struggles, had been worth it. Her son was her strength, and from that moment on, she would do everything to ensure he had the life he deserved. The future was still uncertain, and the challenges were not over. But for the first time, Ryan felt she could face them. She had been through the worst, and now, all that mattered was the little being in her arms. And so, with her heart full of love and determination, Ryan began a new chapter of her life. The years had passed like a breeze, and Ryan's life was completely different from that time of despair and suffering. Now, she stood behind the counter of her own store, a small and cozy decor shop in a bustling neighborhood of New York. The store, which had started small, was a reflection of her resilience and hard work. Every corner was carefully decorated with furniture and pieces she had handpicked herself. Ryan smiled as she served her customers, radiating happiness. The woman who once carried the weight of the world on her shoulders was now strong, independent, and fulfilled. She had been through it all, faced battles that most couldn't endure, but in the end, she had won. It wasn't just her store that brought her joy, but the most important person in her life, her son Lucas. Lucas, who had once been on the brink of death, was now a healthy, strong, and determined young man. He was graduating from law school, the pride and joy of Ryan. Seeing her son grow and prosper, even without the presence of his biological father, was her greatest victory. Each of Lucas's achievements was a reminder that she had made the right decisions, even in the darkest moments. That afternoon, as she organized some merchandise, the doorbell chimed. Looking up, Ryan saw Lucas entering the store, smiling from ear to ear. His smile was just like hers, wide, warm, and sincere. "Look who's here," Ryan joked, opening her arms for him. "Hey, Mom." Lucas hugged her tightly, and Ryan felt the same wave of emotion she always felt when she touched him. He was her greatest blessing. Lucas was tall, with dark hair and a determined gaze that showed he knew what he wanted from life. At 23 years old, he was about to graduate from law school, and his performance was excellent. He had the same sense of justice that she had always cultivated, and now he was determined to use his skills to help those in need. "I have some news," he said, his eyes sparkling. Ryan raised her eyebrows, curious. "What is it?" "I've been called for an interview at one of the biggest law firms in New York. If everything goes well, I can start working there right after graduation." Ryan's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Lucas, my God, that's incredible," she exclaimed, hugging him again. "I always knew you'd go far, but this is more than I could have dreamed." Lucas smiled, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. He stepped back a little and looked into his mother's eyes. "All of this, it's because of you, Mom. I would never have gotten here without your effort, your dedication." You've always been by my side, even when it was tough. I owe you everything." Ryan took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. The weight of the memories and the journey they had taken together always moved her, but they were memories that strengthened her. Every sleepless night, every fight for his treatment, every time she had to humiliate herself to get what her son needed, it had all been worth it. "You never owed me anything, Lucas. Just the fact that you're here, well and happy, is the greatest reward I could have," she said, her voice soft and full of love. For a moment, the two stood in silence, just smiling at each other. Ryan always knew that Lucas had curiosity about his biological father. He never asked directly, respecting her silence on the matter, but what he didn't know was that she had made a promise to herself, never to tell him about Oliver. Oliver, who had never wanted to know Lucas, who had refused to help him when they needed it most, didn't deserve the son she had raised with so much love. Lucas was a part of Ryan, and his father, to her, was no one but a closed chapter in the past. "Mom," Lucas began, with a more serious expression, "I know you never wanted to talk about my father, but I wanted you to know that it doesn't matter who he is. I don't need him. You've always been everything I needed. If you ever want to tell me about him, I'll understand. But if you don't, that's okay too. I have everything I need right here with you." Ryan's heart nearly burst with pride and gratitude. Lucas was so mature, so understanding. She knew he deserved to know the truth, but she also knew that the love they shared was stronger than anything. He was the fruit of her courage, her sacrifice, and that was enough. She placed her hand on Lucas's face, looking at him with affection. "I love you, son. And truly, your future is what matters to me. Everything I did was to ensure you had the life you deserve. Who your father is or was doesn't change any of that. You are the man you chose to be, and I am so proud of you." Lucas smiled, emotional, and hugged her again. "I love you too, Mom. I'll always love you." As the two left the store together, walking through the bustling streets of New York, Ryan looked up at the sky, feeling the gentle breeze against her face. The future was full of promises, and this time, she was certain that everything would be all right. She had kept her promise, protecting Lucas from a painful past and giving him a bright future. And now, mother and son walked together, ready to face any challenge that destiny might bring, but she never expected destiny to demand so much. Days later, the doorbell chimed as Oliver entered Ryan's small store. His once arrogant eyes now wandered nervously around the room until they found Ryan. "Ryan?" Oliver's voice trembled. Ryan looked up from the counter, confused. "Can I help you? Do you need assistance?" Oliver stepped forward, hesitant. "It's me, Oliver." The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan, who had been arranging a shelf behind the counter, dropped a box in surprise. "Oliver?" Ryan repeated, incredulous. "What do you want after all this time?" "I kept my word, and your name was never mentioned in this house." Oliver, the once powerful millionaire, was now very thin, with no hair on his head, and walking slowly. Tears streamed down his aged face. I need your help. I need my son's help. I'm sick. I have cancer. I need a bone marrow transplant. And I have no siblings left, and our son is my only and last hope." Ryan was paralyzed, her face a mix of shock and anger. "You humiliated me, scorned our son, asked me to abort him, and now you're asking for my help? The world doesn't turn, it flips." "I know I don't deserve it," Oliver sobbed, "but I'm begging. Please. I will talk to my son. I will expose everything, and he will decide whether to help you or not. But for now, don't show up here." Oliver left the store, head down, knowing that life had given him a harsh lesson. He hadn't helped his son when he was born, but now, to have a chance at life, he would have to pray to the heavens that his son was better than he was. After a few days, while he was in his office, he received a message from his secretary that Lucas was there, wanting to speak with him. Lucas entered and just looked at the figure of his father. After a long moment, Lucas spoke, his voice cold. "I will do it. Not for you, but because I'm not like you. I wouldn't abandon someone to die, even someone who abandoned me first." Oliver looked up, hopeful, But Lucas continued. But understand this. Making the donation doesn't mean you get to be my father again. You lost that right 23 years ago. I grew up without you. I learned to be a man without you. And I will continue my life without you. Oliver nodded, defeated. I understand. Thank you, Lucas. You are a better man than I ever was. Weeks later, the donation was made. Lucas recovered quickly, but he kept his word. He wanted no further contact with Oliver. For him, the only thing they shared now was blood and bone marrow, and that was more than Oliver ever deserved. The end. Are you enjoying the stories? Tell me in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us.
See you next time.